Welcome to Chapter 5, our first discussion that covers an entire organ system. Welcome to our discussion of skin. It has you covered. Learning outcomes for this first video. Need to name the types of tissues that compose the epidermis and the dermis. List the major layers of the dermis, the epidermis, and describes the functions of each of these layers. And describe the factors that normally contribute to skin color. There are several. And briefly describe how changes in skin color might be used clinically to help diagnose certain diseases. Some interesting stuff there. Your skin, also known as your integument, is a major organ system. It consists of two distinct layers. Those layers would be the epidermis on the outside, the superficial region. This actually is epithelial tissue. Hey, we're getting some reminders from an earlier chapter there. The next layer is the dermis. It's below the epidermis, and it is the leathery part of your skin, and it's mostly fibrous connective tissue. That's actually where skin proper stops, but there is another bit of tissue below that, another layer known as the hypodermis, or superficial fascia. This is the subcutaneous layer. It's deep to the skin. It contains quite a bit of fat in most people. It's not a part of the skin, but it does share some of the functions of the skin. And as I said just a moment ago, fat adipose tissue is stored here, and that absorbs shock and insulates the body. It also is good at anchoring skin to the muscles underneath the skin. We have a really busy image on screen that shows us skin. There's a lot going on in here, and what I'm going to do is start on the left-hand side and take us counterclockwise around the skin. Sticking off the top of the image here, let's just get these out of the way kind of quickly. You clearly have some hairs on the top, and what you can see visible above the skin is referred to as the hair shaft. We'll look at the details of hair a little later in this chapter, but the thing I want you to catch first is that the skin is separated into several distinct layers. The two major layers are the epidermis, which is colored more brown here, and the dermis, which is colored more pink here. Each of those has sub-layers that we will talk about in some detail. Those really are skin proper. So epidermis and dermis. Below that, though, we have one other layer to talk about. The hypodermis is actually technically not skin, but it is sometimes and actually quite commonly talked about when you learn about skin. Before we leave that layering discussion entirely, I want to talk about two sub-layers of the dermis. We'll get to the sub-layers of the epidermis in a little while. But the two sub-layers of the dermis are the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer has little papilla or little finger-like projections. Look over on the right for just a minute. And on the right-hand side, you can see dermal papillae sticking up, looking very much like the egg crate foam you might find on a mattress pad. Back over to the other side here, the reticular layer is the deeper layer of the dermis. It's made of irregular connective tissue. We'll look at that in more detail a little later on. Next, we'll take a look at some of the other labels on the screen. There are nerve fibers or sensory nerve fibers with free nerve endings that handle sensations like hot, cold, and some pain. We also have a structure here in the skin, fairly deep in the dermis, known as a lamellar corpuscle. Your lab book will call that thing a Pacinian corpuscle. The word lamellar means layered, and as you look at this, it looks almost like a fingerprint. Think instead in 3 dimensions, and think of what it would look like if you cut an onion in half top to bottom. All those layers are where the lamellar part of that name comes from. Next to that, we have a hair follicle receptor, like a little woven basket around the base of the hair. Those yellow fibers are nerve fibers called the hair root plexus, and they help to detect whether your hairs are being bent. Continuing around with our labels, we see some fat labeled here as adipose tissue, as well as some blood vessels known as the cutaneous plexus that help you do things like blush. Continuing up, we see a cup-like structure called a hair root, and attached to that we have some glands that produce oil. These are sebaceous glands or oil glands. I'm going to highlight those actually in 2 places because you can see them sticking off the follicle here, but in the picture a little more to the left you see them in cross-section. Those are oil glands. They produce an oily substance known as sebum that helps to keep your skin moisturized. The next label up shows a very interesting muscle. This muscle is called arrector pili. The erector pili muscles are what give you goosebumps when they cause your hairs to stand on end. Coming up next, we get to one of two kinds of sweat glands in the skin, and this one happens to be an eccrine sweat gland. Eccrine sweat glands make cooling sweat. So if you're out running, you get hot and sweaty, and sweat is pouring off of you from running, you're being cooled down by sweat from eccrine sweat glands. And you find these over most places of the body. There's a couple of special spots that have a different kind of sweat gland that we'll talk about a little later on. The next label coming up would be sweat pore, the opening of that sweat gland. And the last and final label that we've not yet talked about is a subpapillary plexus, the blood vessels in the papillus itself. Let's talk first about the top layer of the skin, the epidermis. This is made of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Again, more visitors from our last chapter. This is dry. It's a dry membrane. The upper layers are dead. Lower layers are alive. Let's talk about them. We actually have 4 or 5 distinct layers, depending on where we are in the body. In 2 places, the palm of your hand, the sole of your foot, you have thick skin. Everywhere else would be considered thin skin, sometimes called hairy skin. And from the bottom up, the 5 layers of skin would be stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, which we only find in the palm of the hand, sole of the foot, and stratum corneum. We'll talk about each of those layers in its own turn from the bottom up a little bit later on in this chapter, actually probably on the next few slides. We also have a few cell types to be concerned with here. There are 4 cell types. In fact, there are keratinocytes, melanocytes, dendritic cells, sometimes known as Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells. Just a little bit about me in this moment, though. These 2 words, Langerhans and Merkels, these are historical names named commonly after the person who discovered them or somebody important to the person who discovered them. This is an idea known as an eponym. An eponymic name is a name of a structure in anatomy named after somebody, and it's been historically done quite a lot. I personally have a bias for a structural name as opposed to an eponymic name, and you'll often hear me make that comment. But a dendritic name is named for its kind of branched shape. The word dendritic refers to tree-like or branched. Tactile is a functional name that tells you that these cells help you feel things. I kind of prefer those descriptive names as opposed to historical named after somebody names myself. Just a personal bias, though. Now, on to the next page. Here are what the layers look like if we look at a section through the skin. So if you look at this upper picture, we're going to take a slice of that upper layer of the skin, the epidermis, and look at the layers in thin, hairy skin. So this is not the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot. We're going to see 4, not 5 layers here. Let's start at the bottom. 1 cell thick, the deepest of the layers of the epidermis, we have stratum basale. It's 1 row thick. These are actively mitotic stem cells, meaning they're dividing and making new cells. So all of the cells above were born here in the stratum basale. Oddly enough, new cells are born and then pushed up toward the top as new cells are made below them. Every once in a while, we'll see dendritic cells and melanocytes in this bottom layer. Melanocytes make skin pigment, and we'll have a whole section about skin color we'll talk about later on in this video. Up from that, we have stratum spinosum. The word spinosum means spiny or thorny. These cells are spiny in the way that a raisin is kind of spiky or wrinkly. This can be several cells thick, depending on where we are in the body. These cells are all tied together by desmosomes, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. Think again of that bit of Velcro sewed together that I talked about in a previous video. These cells are full of thick bundles of intermediate-sized filaments that are made up of a protein known as prekeratin. Interesting thing about stratum spinosum, the cells in here are beginning to slow down their metabolism toward an eventual death that happens in the next layer up, which would be stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum in most parts of the body is about 5 to 7 cells thick. They're flattened out. They're no longer cuboidal as they were down below. The organelles are beginning to die. The cytoplasm are full of granules that release lipids and a compound known as keratohyalin. At the upper part of stratum granulosum, cells are actually dead. The uppermost layer on the entire skin is called the stratum corneum. The word corneum means horny, like the dry horn on a cow. This is the outer layer of skin. It's what you see as you look at your body. And it's 20 to 30 cells thick, all dead cells. And it's essentially a flat membrane sac full of a dry protein, which is waterproof, called keratin. There are also glycolipids in the spaces between these cells to provide some lubrication and moisture. So those are the main layers that you find over most of the body. Inserted between stratum corneum and stratum granulosum in the palm of the hand and the sole of the foot, we would find that fifth layer, which is known as stratum lucidum, which we don't see here. Let's take a minute to look at some cells in the epidermis. There are several cell types. The first, actually the major cell type that you find here, over 90% of the cells, are a type of cell known as keratinocytes. They produce a fibrous, waterproof protein called keratin. Most of the cells of the epidermis fit this description. They're held tightly to each other by desmosomes. It helps keep your skin from coming apart like an old ragged cloth. Melanocytes make up about 10% to 25% of the cells deepest in the epidermis. They produce a pigment called melanin. It's a color that's packaged in little packets called melanosomes, and they protect the apical surface of keratinocyte nucleuses from UV damage. Melanin is your natural sunscreen, so it protects your nucleus, protects your DNA from UV damage. It's why you tan as you get exposed to the sun. Sunlight can potentially damage DNA, and this is the way the skin protects itself. Dendritic cells, also known as Langerhans cells, are macrophages. They're immune system cells, and they're there to protect your skin from bacteria that might find its way into the deeper layers. Tactile cells, sometimes called Merkel cells, are sensory touch receptors, and they help to detect light touch. Over the next few slides, we'll look at the layers of the epidermis from the bottom up. We'll start with the stratum basale. Of course, you probably figured out by now the word stratum means layer. The stratum basale is the basal or bottom layer of the epidermis. It's the deepest of all of those layers as a result. Sometimes it, together with the layer right above, that would be the stratum spinosum, together those pair are called stratum germinativum. And the reason for that is because those are the two layers that germinate or produce new cells. Most of the new cells come from stratum basale, but a few can still come from stratum spinosum. This is firmly attached to the dermis that's beneath it. It is a single row of stem cells. So stratum basale is one cell thick, important to note. They're actively mitotic, meaning, of course, that they divide. When one of these cells divides, it produces two cells referred to as daughter cells. One of those two cells stays in the basal layer, and the other heads toward the surface. That process takes 25 to 45 days, and as that cell is on its way up to the surface, it dies somewhere around the stratum granulosum. And the other of the two cells stays in the stratum basale and is the stem cell, which will continue the process of dividing. Melanocytes make up about 10 to 25% of this bottom layer. So about a quarter, or a little less than a quarter of the cells in that lower layer are these color-producing cells called melanocytes. The next layer up is stratum spinosum. The name means the spiny or prickly layer. Think of what a grape looks like when it begins to shrivel to a raisin. The prickly part of the name, or the spiny part of the name, is a little misleading. They're wrinkly cells. This layer is several cells thick instead of stratum basale, which was only one cell thick. Here we have a web-like intermediate protein fiber that attaches these cells to each other through desmosomes. There are a lot of melanosomes in this layer, as well as some dendritic cells being the immune system cells. Coming up one layer, we get to stratum granulosum. These are granular. They actually do have granules inside them. This layer varies from typically about 4 cells to 6 cells in thickness, and the cell appearance changes as it goes through this layer. The cells actually are beginning to die here. They flatten out. The nuclei and the organelles inside the cell begin to break down. A process known as keratinization begins as these cells begin to gather inside them granules of a molecule known as keratohyalin. This is a precursor molecule to a molecule that will appear in upper layers known as keratin. And in addition, these cells accumulate lamellar granules. These are water-resistant glycolipids which help to slow down the water loss. And cells above this layer pretty much are dead. They are too far away from the capillaries and the deep dermis to get any nutrients at all. So as we get higher and higher in the epidermis, the cells are farther away from their nutrient source, their blood source, so they are not as prone to living. The next layer up is called the stratum lucidum. Keep in mind, this is the layer that's only found in thick skin. Thick skin being the skin on the palm of the hand, the sole of the foot. The word lucid means clear, so this layer actually does have kind of a clear appearance when you see it under a microscope. It is a thin, translucent band above the stratum granulosum and below the next layer, which is the stratum corneum. Stratum corneum, the word corneum means horny, not intertachyway. Stop thinking that. This is horny like the horn of a cow, kind of dry, a little rough. This is anywhere from actually 8 or 10 all the way up to 30 cells thick. This author says 20 to 30 rows of cells thick, and that's perfectly fine. These are flat, almost pancake-like cells. They have no more nucleus. The nucleus has been broken down completely, and they're full of a protein known as keratin, which, as I've said a couple of times, I think is a waterproof protein. They make up about 3/4 of the total thickness of your epidermis, not your skin, but your epidermis. Though dead, these cells do have some important functions for the body. They protect cells deeper from the invasions of the environment, like bacteria, and they also protect from water loss. These actually function very much like shingles on the roof of your house. They protect the tissues below from abrasion, from penetration. They're a barrier to keep bacteria and other microbes out. They're a barrier against chemical attacks, and they're also a barrier against physical assaults. Things like you rubbing your hand across some rough concrete. That would actually tear up more tender tissues, but this stratum corneum survives that kind of attack quite well. Cells actually change as they make their way through the epidermis. They start out as cuboidal cells in the stratum basale, and the changes that we see are handled by a specialized form of apoptosis. You may remember from an earlier chapter, apoptosis is effectively controlled cell death. And in the journey from the bottom of the epidermis to the top, from stratum basale up to stratum corneum, the nucleus and the organelles inside the cell break down. The plasma membrane begins to thicken, and that actually allows your cells to slough off as dandruff and dander. You shed about 50,000 skin cells every minute. And you may not want to hear this, but it's estimated that over 90% of the dust in your house is actually dead skin cells. What a thought, huh? Right, looking at the next page, we can actually see some of these cells. We have labels on the side, which I'm going to ignore because we've already talked about those layers. I want to focus on the named cells at the bottom of this picture. And I'm going to zoom in and talk about a few of these things along the way, because we see a whole lot of keratinocytes that basically are most of the cells in this picture. So all the little brown guys in this picture are keratinocytes. They are the most typical type of skin cell. I want to next focus on this purple cell here. It's a dendritic cell. They tend to stay deep in the epidermis, and these dendritic cells are a specialized kind of white blood cell known as a macrophage. They're part of a group known as the wandering macrophages, and they're here deep in the epidermis waiting on pathogenic invaders like bacteria or things like that to recognize and destroy before they get any deeper. The blue cell with the yellow underneath it is a partnership, a pair between a nerve ending and a tactile cell, which is involved in detecting touch, kind of a relatively medium to light touch. The next cell is an interesting one. It's a melanocyte, and it lives in the deepest layers of the epidermis. It makes the pigment melanin, which is the compound that gives your skin color. And I want you to notice that a lot of the keratinocytes around this cell have color granules in them. They didn't make those. The gray melanocyte, gray in this cartoon picture, has a lot of branches, and those branches reach out and touch neighboring cells, and through those branches they hand out color packets like you might pass out candy on Halloween. So all of the keratinocytes that have color in them did not make the color. The color was made by the melanocyte. Below the dermis, we find the leathery part of the skin, the epidermis. It's very strong, it's very flexible, it's made of connective tissue. Cells that we find here would include fibroblasts that made all of the collagen fiber we'll find in here, macrophages, some mast cells, which are a specialized kind of immune system cell, and a lot of white blood cells. Fibers bind this matrix very tightly together. They are, in effect, leather, and if we were to skin a person like we would skin a cow or a pig, this would be the stuff that is leather. So the dermis of a cow is cow leather. Dermis in us contains nerve fibers, blood, lymphatic vessels, contains epidermal hair follicles, oil and sweat glands, and it actually has two distinct layers. Those two layers would be the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Before I leave this page, though, I do want to point out something here. Blood in the dermis is the only source of nutrients for the epidermis above. We've said it before, but it's worth emphasizing now. The epidermis above has no blood supply. So looking at this picture, you can sort of see that. There are plenty of blood vessels in the deep dermis, which is pink in this image, and in the brown epidermis above, no blood vessels. So any blood that gets to the live cells of the epidermis has to come by diffusion. Actually, the blood doesn't travel by diffusion, the oxygen and the nutrients do. The dermis, as we've said before, is separated into papillary layer, which is nice and wavy on the top, and reticular layer, which is deeper. So papillary layer first. Let's discuss this. It's made up of areolar or loose connective tissue with lots of collagen, elastic fibers, and blood vessels. It is indeed a loose tissue. Phagocytes, which are white blood cells that eat invaders, patrols for microorganisms here. And we see these bumps on top, these dermal papillae, which are the superficial peg-like projections. And in some spots, they actually help to create patterns on your skin like your fingerprints. Dermal papillae contain capillary loops. They also contain another kind of touch receptor known as a Meissner's corpuscle, which we've not talked about before. These are often described as looking a lot like a light bulb with an outer capsule and a coiled up nerve fiber on the inside, but more about those a little later on. Some also contain free nerve endings, kind of a bare naked nerve ending that are often pain or even temperature receptors. And in a thick skin area like the palm of your hand or the sole of your foot, we have dermal ridges that actually cause epidermal ridges and do indeed form your fingerprints. These are referred to as friction ridges, and what they do for you is they enhance your ability to grip either with your fingers or your toes, and they also contribute to your sense of touch. The pattern that we see there would be your fingerprint or your toe or palm or sole print. This image shows that nicely. We can see the friction ridges, and if you zoom in close enough, which we've done here, you can actually see the opening of sweat glands. This is a magnification of about 12 times power. You can actually do this good with a pretty standard magnifying glass. The deeper layer of the dermis is called the reticular layer. It makes up about 80% of the total thickness. It's made of dense fibrous connective tissue instead of loose fibrous connective tissue like the the papillary layer is. Elastic fibers here do give some stretchiness to this tissue. There's a lot of collagen, which gives a lot of strength, and it also helps to retain water. And there's some interesting features in this layer. Don't get upset. Don't get freaky. I'm going to say a word here, and it means something completely different in this spot. You have cleavage in your skin. Cleavage lines form as collagen fibers run parallel to each other and parallel to the skin surface. And these are not visible from the outside, but they're important to surgeons who are cutting into you if they don't want to leave scars. They can, if they're followed like a pattern, help to minimize scars if surgeons don't cut across them. These are sometimes called Langer's lines. It's another one of those things named after somebody that I'm not real fond of. And this is sort of what that idea looks like. The lines that you see here are typical patterns found on most people, and if surgeons were to cut across these lines, they would be more likely to leave a scar. If they cut along these lines, sort of with the grain, if you will, they're much less likely to leave scars, which explains the direction of some of the cuts that you might have for some of your surgeries. Let's look at some skin markings that are visible near the surface. They're called flexure lines, and they're actually dermal folds that are either at or near joints. At these spots, the dermis attaches tightly to much deeper structures like joints, and the skin can't slide at this spot for easy joint movement. It causes deep creases. You can find these sorts of flexure lines on your hands, your wrist, your fingers, your soles, and your toes, and they look very much like this. These are flexure lines visible on the digits, your fingers. You also have flexure lines visible on your palm, and not labeled, but very obvious, you have flexure lines on your wrist. Other skin markings. Stria are silvery white scars, sometimes referred to as stretch marks. They are the result of stretching that causes tears in the dermis, usually along Langer's lines or those cleavage lines. And if you stop and look at that image we had up a few minutes ago, you might find that stretch marks on your body actually follow the pattern of those cleavage lines. A blister is actually a result of a short-term trauma. It's a fluid-filled pocket that separates the epidermis from the dermis, and they're temporary. They go away after a while, they heal. Let's take a few minutes and discuss skin color. It's a little more complex than you might at first expect. There are three main pigments that actually can contribute to skin color. Only one of them is actually made in the skin itself. That would be melanin. The other two pigments that contribute to skin color include keratin and hemoglobin, which is of course found in your blood. We're going to talk about each of these in their turn. Melanin will be first. Melanin comes in two main forms. One version is kind of a reddish yellow, the other version is kind of a brownish black color. The actual color of the skin of an individual depends on the relative amounts of these two variations of melanin. Individuals, of course, have melanocytes or pigment-producing cells in about the same number, depending or regardless of which race you are. You all have about the same number of melanocytes. The difference in skin color comes in amount of melanin made and which version of melanin is made. Melanin is actually made in melanocytes and then migrates over to keratinocytes to help protect the nucleus from UV radiation. There's a lot of melanin in both freckles and pigmented moles, so they tend to be darker. Sun exposure causes an increase in melanin production, so you become tan, which is, by the way, an incredibly bad idea. Any darkening is bad and likely to damage the DNA. Sunspots, called tinea versicolor, are a fungal infection and are not related at all to melanin. Keratin and hemoglobin are the other two molecules I mentioned. Keratin actually is a yellow to orange pigment that is most obvious in the palms and the soles. It accumulates in the stratum corneum and the hypodermis, and it actually can be converted into vitamin A for vision, and it actually comes from yellow root vegetables. It also accounts for the yellowish tinge in some Asian individuals, and there are actually some melanin variations. Now, an interesting phenomenon that does happen, keratin is very common in yellow and orange root vegetables like carrots and sweet potatoes. You can actually eat enough keratin to turn yourself yellow. And it's a fairly common thing in young children who have just begun eating baby food, because quite often a favorite baby food is strained carrots or strained sweet potatoes. And I've got a cousin who is a pediatrician who often had mothers bring their babies to him, and they would say, "Oh, doc, my baby's yellow. I think their liver's failing." And he would ask, "What are they doing lately? Have they changed their diet?" "Yeah, they stopped having milk and they're starting to have baby food." "Oh, what's their favorite baby food?" "They really like carrots." "Well, if you'll stop feeding your child carrots, your child will stop being yellow." So yes, you can eat enough carrots and sweet potatoes to turn yourself yellow. Be careful with that. Hemoglobin is, of course, the reddish molecule we find in blood, and it's responsible for the pinkish hue of fair-skinned people. White people are white. White people are really kind of pink, and it's because of hemoglobin. Now, skin color can also be useful in diagnosing some diseases. We'll talk about a few interesting skin color variants along the way and some of the diseases that might be relevant here. Cyanosis is the first we'll look at. It's kind of a bluish skin color and indicates a low level of oxygen present in the blood. Erythema is redness, and it can indicate fever or hypertension or inflammation or even allergies. Paleness or pallor, sometimes referred to as blanching, can indicate anemia or low blood pressure or fear or anger. You may have heard of becoming pale with fear, same idea here. Jaundice is a yellowish color that's not due to eating too many carrots. Instead, this actually is due to liver disorders. And there's an interesting phenomenon known as bronzing. It's not a good thing. This is not a tan, although it's a somewhat similar color. It's a inadequate amount of steroid hormones in Addison's disease. And then, of course, bruises indicate you've got blood clots happening underneath the skin. That's kind of most of what we need to talk about in this video. It's been a very long video, I know, so let's do a few concept checks. Here are a few thoughts to check along the way. As usual, I'm not going to give you the answers. I'm just going to give you things to think about. These are from your textbook, so you can certainly find these in your textbook. The first is, what's going on? Yeah, this is page 1 of 2. There's a lot of these. While walking barefoot in a barn, Jeremy stepped on a rusty nail that penetrated the epidermis on the sole of his foot. Name the layers that the nail pierced from the superficial skin surface to the junction with the dermis. So you're going to stop when you get to the dermis. Just the epidermis, top to bottom. What are those layers? And since he stepped through on the nail with his foot, this is an area of thick skin. So make sure you include all 5 layers. Next, the stratum basale, and in some cases the stratum spinosum, may be called the stratum germinativum. This secondary name, germinativum, refers to what major function that these layers have. I told you earlier in the video. Why are desmosomes important for connecting keratinocytes to each other? Second page of concept checks. Yeah, I know. Get out of the way here, guys. We got other stuff to do. Given that epithelia have no blood vessels, forgive that second one. Given that epithelia have no blood vessels, which epidermal layers would you expect to be the best nourished cells? Following that, which layer of the dermis is responsible for producing your fingerprint patterns? And finally, you've just gotten a paper cut. It's quite painful, but it does not bleed. Has this cut penetrated into the dermis or just the epidermis? That, folks, will do this quite long video. We'll move on. We'll have another video in a while, but for now, just have some fun studying, and I'll see you in the next video.